It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here. We are one of the co-sponsors with the ICAS, and it's also a pleasure to be able to do the introduction. My task is rather limited because all of you have the bio in front of you, so I'm going to only say a few things which have to do with a focus on the speaker. And our speaker is Ambassador David Bolton. David has just recently retired from 32 years in the Department of State. He has been an ambassador for 12 years. We have a common root, except he's been more successful. He and I both were in the Office of Legal Advisor, and then he rotated over to more of the policy aspects. But he has had several very pertinent positions that he's still very au courant about. One, he was the president, the chairman, of the Arctic Council. And so he knows a lot about the Arctic, which all of us know is an increasingly important issue for international cooperation. In addition, he headed as I said, for 12 years, our negotiations on fisheries, which are very important to both the United States and the countries in Asia, including China particularly, is the largest fishing country. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't know a lot about ocean policy, because that subject was also under his jurisdiction. So I think we're fortunate to have a very distinguished politician in the State Department sense, which is not a pejorative characterization. And so if I can, Dave, turn the platform over to you.
Thanks very much, Myron. I also want to thank ICAS, the other sponsors, Dr. Hong in particular, for inviting me here today. I'm only going to speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then I would be happy to take questions from you if you have any. When the topic of the United States and China and oceans comes up, people inevitably think first of the South China Sea. Indeed, if you look at your program, you will have an entire program on the South China Sea coming up this afternoon. And I don't mean to understate the importance of that part of the ocean, the significance of the competing claims over features in the South China Sea and marine areas there between China and a number of its neighbors, the differences of view between China and the United States about what is happening in the South China Sea, and the potential for conflict there. And yet, there is a larger context. And what I hope to do in a reasonably brief period is to lay out for you a whole range of other ocean issues on which the United States and China have managed to cooperate successfully for quite some time at the bilateral, regional, and global levels. And as I go through these examples, perhaps one thing you could be thinking about is, are there lessons to draw from these areas of successful cooperation that might be useful for the next panel and the topics that they will raise about the South China Sea? Clearly, the United States and China are two of the most important countries on oceans issues generally. As Myron mentioned, China is the largest producer of seafood in the world. The United States is the largest exclusive economic zone of any country in the world. On international fisheries issues, the United States and China are members of a large number of organizations that are mandated to manage the world's fisheries, and not just in the Pacific Ocean that China and the United States share, also in the Atlantic, and in a moment I'll talk a little bit about the Arctic as well. And China has become a much more active player in these fora. And while international fisheries are not yet managed with great success, the record is spotty at best, I would point to a lot of areas of progress that these regional organizations have been making, in part because of the contributions of the United States and China working together in them. The U.S. and China also have annual bilateral meetings on fisheries. One just took place in Beijing last week, where they compare notes. They try to align policies. They exchange scientific information about fisheries. They try to persuade each other to adjust their positions for the greater good. And there have been some notable things that have grown out of this type of cooperation. For many years, the United States and China have maintained a bilateral agreement having to do with ship riders. What are ship riders? Ship rider is a law enforcement official from one country, in this case usually China, that rides aboard, in this case a U.S. Coast Guard vessel, so that when illegal fishing is found on the high seas, perhaps by a vessel flagged in China or with a Chinese master, that law enforcement official from China riding aboard the U.S. Coast Guard vessel can actually enforce Chinese law, and vice versa. This is one of the longest standing shipwrighter agreements the United States has, and indeed last week in China, I'm happy to report that both sides agreed not only to renew it, but to expand the operations under it. One of the regional fishery organizations in the world manages the fisheries around Antarctica. And those fisheries have been reasonably well managed over time. Indeed, that organization, known as CAMELAR, is often held up as one of the models. Last year, that organization took an unprecedented step. It agreed to create within the waters around Antarctica, particularly in the Ross Sea part, the largest marine protected area in the world. That would not have happened without China and the United States working together. Indeed, I was part of a delegation that went to Beijing a few years ago to try to allay certain concerns and make certain accommodations for the purpose of getting China to go along with this, which they did. It may have helped that President Obama raised this with President Xi during a visit that coincided with these particular talks. At the other end of the planet, the Arctic Ocean is opening up in ways that are unprecedented. People are referring to a new ocean at the top of the world. The sea ice is receding, and there is the prospect for a lot greater human activity in that ocean. Although China is not an Arctic state, not an Arctic nation, it does not have land that is in the Arctic itself, it nevertheless has important and legitimate interests in the Arctic region. China put out an Arctic strategy paper, a policy paper recently outlining those. And just last November, November 30th to be precise, here in Washington, China and the United States and 8 others agreed to a fisheries deal for the high seas portion of the Arctic, basically saying that there should not be fishing that takes place there until there is enough science with which to manage fisheries there properly. A good example of multilateral cooperation, but yes, required China and the United States in particular to work together. Although the United States and most other countries do not recognize Taiwan as an independent state, Nevertheless, there is a reality that Taiwan owns or controls a fishing fleet that by some measures is the 6th largest in the world. And if Taiwan doesn't have a seat at the table at these organizations that manage the world's fisheries, there will be a problem. They will not abide by the rules that everybody else agrees to. And so, over the last 20 years or so, the United States and China have found formulas to allow Taiwan, not called Taiwan in these contexts, to actually have that seat at the table in a way that squares with the views of both countries and the other participants there. Taiwan, as Chinese Taipei, is now a full member of more than a half dozen regional fishery management organizations, and there's one where that will happen soon too in the Atlantic, currently being negotiated. There are some outstanding issues that the two sides have to work on fisheries, and one in particular is this. At the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization a few years ago, another groundbreaking treaty was negotiated by all the members, including the United States and China, to prevent so-called illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing worldwide through port state controls. That treaty is now in force. The United States is party to it, and some 60 or so other countries. China has not yet. But last week in Beijing, they provided assurances that they are moving toward ratifying that, which would be a great step forward. I think China needs to do more, also to control its fishing and transport vessels at sea, to discourage the consumption of shark fins. There is an agenda of further work to be done. But the real point I'm trying to make is there are these areas of cooperation. Let me change topics briefly. There is a broader oceans agenda. It's not all about fish. The United States, some years ago, launched a series of high-profile, high-level ocean conferences, the Our Ocean Conference series. It started here in Washington, then moved, there was one in Chile, came back to DC the year after. Just last year it was in Malta. The EU hosted it. Next year it will be in Indonesia, then in Norway, then in then in Palau. At these conferences, countries and international organizations and non-governmental organizations come to make pledges of things that they are going to do. And China has sent high-ranking officials to each of ththese conferences and has made pledges. Here are some of the commitments that China has made at these partnerships. In 2015, the U.S. and China announced a partnership between the coastal cities of Xiamen and Weihai, and on the one hand, and San Francisco and New York on the other, to share best practices related to waste management, a big problem. China announced in 2016 a commitment to restore 16 bays and lots of other square miles of particularly polluted water. China offered 8 million euros for national research projects to deal with the problem of marine microplastics and jellyfish and other problems besetting the world's oceans. In 2017, it announced that it will implement a Blue Bay renovation project in at least 66 bays and adjacent areas. Also in 2017, China announced that it will further strengthen the conservation of its natural coastline in order to assure that it is at least 35% of it is up to the highest level of protection. So in all these ways, China is stepping up to the plate to address growing problems in the marine environment, something that ought to be encouraged and applauded. But there is more work to do here too. The oceans are not in good health. Problems of marine debris, nutrient runoff are still rife. Plastic pollution in the ocean is a particular problem, a lot of it emanating from Asia. China and the other Asian nations need to work more to address these problems. Let me touch on one final example where the United States and China are working well together, at least so far. In New York, at the United Nations, there is under negotiation a new global treaty. It will take its place, if it's successfully concluded, as part of the Law of the Sea Convention framework on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. The basic ideas are to strengthen the conservation rules on the high seas, the world's ocean, and also to create a regime for sharing the benefits of the development of marine genetic resources. In New York, the two basic camps are the OECD countries and the G77 and China. But in reality, China and the United States actually have a lot of similar interests here, particularly with respect to the development of marine genetic resources. I expect to see China and the United States continue to have fairly important, if quiet, talks behind the scenes about finding the compromises that would need to be struck in order for this agreement to actually arrive. Those are my examples. There are many others I could have pointed to, but I think you'll see that there is a lot of work going on between the two countries that doesn't directly involve the South China Sea set of issues. And one question I will have, or at least be looking at moving forward, is this. Both sides are engaged in a kind of bureaucratic reorganization on ocean issues. In China, the State Oceanic Administration is being changed around. I don't understand fully where that's going or what is happening. Perhaps some of my colleagues here from China or from the Institute might have a better sense than I, but it is at least a little worrisome. Who will be the real players on these issues in China in the future? Will they have enough money? Will they have a mandate to make important decisions? And then on the U.S. side, too, there has been in place a national ocean policy, but it is under review right now in the new administration. Of course, every administration has the right to reconsider policies, but it's not at all clear yet where that is headed, and again, who will be the players and whether they will have the money and the authority to make the decisions that will need to be made moving forward. Still, I think the prospects for continued cooperation between the United States and China are good. The interests both countries have in the oceans are profound and enduring, and they don't change radically, certainly not in the United States, administration to administration. So I expect to see some continuity here. That's all I have for you, friends, but I'm happy to take questions, and maybe Myron can help me as a traffic cop here. Please.
Thank you. I'm going to depart from the way we do questions with the panelists and ask for you to make a question, not a comment, unless it's really brief, and then ask Ambassador Bolton if he'll respond to that, and then go to the next person. And I saw your hand already, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Yan Yan from China National Institute for the South China Sea Studies. Well, thank you, Mr. Bolton, for your remarks, and thank you for reminding us that there are more ocean issues that China and the U.S. can talk about other than the South China Sea. And my simple question is that, do you think there is a possibility that the U.S. will ratify the UNCLOS under the Trump administration? Thank you.
Anything's possible. If one were to take a sober look at the profound and enduring interests of the United States with respect to the oceans and line those up with the provisions of that particular treaty, I think anyone would have to conclude that we should have joined that years ago. The United States wanted a stable regime for the oceans. It wanted to secure freedom of navigation for its commercial and military vessels. It wanted to secure resource rights in its exclusive economic zone and on a broad continental shelf. And it got all those things. And the one thing that stuck in the craw of the United States in the early 80s as the convention was being concluded on deep seabed mining, even those provisions were changed a decade later or so, such that the deal currently on offer, I think, is soundly in the U.S. interests. Whether this administration and its colleagues in the Senate, remember it has ultimately to depend on what the Senate thinks, will actually see it that way and move forward, I don't know, but one can always hope.
This gentleman right here.
Please.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have a quite technical questions. Ever since Donald Trump became president, it looks like he is not really in control for the military actions in South China Sea conducted by U.S. forces. I can give you examples. From your opinion, does he really care, or is he in a good kind of communication with the Pentagon in all those military actions, or just U.S. forces in there just do it on its own? So that's my question.
So I hope you realize I'm not actually in the administration any longer, and I don't know what is currently going on. But I can tell you that I was in the administration for the first year of the Trump presidency, and I didn't actually see a radical change in the communications between the White House and the Pentagon and the State Department related to the freedom of navigation exercises. There was certainly a change of tone, but the number and types of exercises there and the communications related to them internally did not change as much as you might think. So my impression was that more was made of the change than actually met the eye.
This gentleman.
Joseph Xin from Shanghai Institute for International Studies. And my question is about the fishery cooperation in South China Sea. You see, usually we think DOC is just a safe product of China and ASEAN member states. Because of fishery issue, we cannot get the consensus. And some Southeast Asian countries are annoyed because China's ban on fishery in some seasons, and also China is also annoyed because some Southeast Asian countries tried to arrest China's fishermen. And do you think the fishery cooperation in South China Sea between China and Southeast Asian countries possible or potential scenarios? Thank you.
Thank you. The question has to do with whether the fisheries issues in the South China Sea could be an example of cooperation. Well, the first thing to say, of course, is that the United States does not claim any waters in the South China Sea and doesn't have, to my knowledge, any fishing vessels operating there. It's really a question about whether China and the other claimant states in the South China Sea can find ways to cooperate. They certainly have a mutual interest in doing so, because as long as there is conflict about fisheries management there, the stocks are almost certain to decline to everyone's disadvantage. So there are other places in the world where countries have managed to put aside their respective claims and find ways to cooperate on fisheries management. Believe it or not, the United States and Canada have maritime boundary disputes outside the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the Dixon Entrance and the Beaufort Sea and still a piece in the Gulf of Maine. And there are fisheries that take place in at least two of those areas. And yes, the United States and Canada have managed to set aside our differences of view about whose water it really is and figure out a way to ensure that there is not overfishing. And so while it's more complicated when there are more than two countries, it is still possible to do, one can hope.
Other, someone? Who are they pointing?
Thank you. Steve Winters, independent consultant. To follow up on that a little bit, you used the term high seas, referring to sort of some of the Arctic waters opening up. So could you comment on some of the effect of territorial decisions on fisheries? For instance, the decision in the Sea of Oshkosh, granting that as territorial waters of Russia, cut off the fishing area which was used for international fishing in the middle of the Sea of Oshkosh. And if the claims that Russia has filed with the UN on the Lomonosov Ridge have come to Russia's favor also, then those won't be high seas, right? And similarly, so of course this impacts the South China Sea in the terms of China's essentially claiming that as its territorial waters, right? So
let's pick that apart piece by piece, okay? The rules relating to jurisdiction over the water in the ocean are different from the rules relating to the land under the ocean. In the Arctic, as elsewhere, countries can claim for fisheries purposes a 200-mile or an exclusive economic zone out to 200 miles from shore. And the 5 states that ring the Central Arctic Ocean have all done that: U.S., China, Canada, Denmark in respect of Greenland, and Norway. There is still a large area in the middle, beyond 200 miles from any of those countries, an area about 2.8 million square kilometers, about the size of the Mediterranean Sea. That is, under international law, high seas, right? That area is, in theory, open for fishing by vessels of any state. It is true, I'll get back to the Sea of Okhotsk in a moment, that there are also as yet unresolved claims to the seafloor under the high seas. Russia, Norway, Denmark on behalf of Greenland have all made submissions to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf in support of their claims to pieces of that. The claims overlap. They will need to first get recommendations from this commission and then negotiate boundaries. The United States and Canada also have a piece of the pie. They have, both the United States and Canada have not yet made submissions to this commission, though Canada is getting quite close. One interesting thing is that the US and Russia will not have any overlap because we have a boundary treaty in place between the United States and Russia that includes the Arctic. Now, in the Sea of Okhotsk, there is a reasonably small area that is beyond 200 miles from any Russian coastline. It is affectionately known as the Peanut Hole, surrounded by the exclusive economic zone of Russia. Russia has used its leverage with respect to vessels from other Asian countries to get them either to stop fishing there or at least to stop fishing in ways that Russia doesn't want, because those vessels still also want to have access to fish in Russian waters adjacent to that high seas area. Not sure what more to say about any of that, but that is at least some sense. I hope I answered your question reasonably well.
Ambassador, I have a question with regard to U.S.
Now I'm worried.
with the United States Arctic policy. And among the Arctic 5, and compared with like Canada and Russia, the United States seems to play a quite key tone.
I'm sorry, say that last part one more time.
So the United States doesn't seem to put a lot of efforts in Arctic governance. That's my own observation. So I remember in Obama administration's period when U.S. serving as the chairman of the Arctic Council, and it does have a very clear policy on promoting environment protection and climate change. So with Trump administration, that climate change is actually an issue that he doesn't like a lot. So what do you see the future of how Trump administration look into Arctic? Thank you.
Compared to the other 7 countries in the Arctic, not only the 4 I mentioned plus the United States before, but Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, the United States does not think of itself so much as an Arctic country. For all the other 7, being part of the Arctic, having an important part of your population looking north and living in the north, is very part of their national identity. We, the United States, have more people living in tropical and subtropical areas than we have north of the Arctic Circle. While the United States chaired the Arctic Council 2015 to 2017, we did manage to bring a lot of attention and energy to Arctic issues. But you were right that since we passed over the chair of the Council to Finland, the level of interest seems to have subsided, at least somewhat. I think that's a fair statement. That would have happened anyway, no matter who was in office. I think the mere transition of chairmanships would have led to at least some diminution of interest. You are also right that the key driver of events in the Arctic is the warming climate there. The Arctic is warming on average more than twice as fast as any other part of the planet. And it is what is causing a lot of people to look at the Arctic now. Interestingly, the U.S. policies relating to climate change in the Arctic itself have not changed appreciably. Last administration to this one. I'll give you an example. One piece of the climate puzzle that relates to the Arctic specifically has to do with black carbon, otherwise known as soot. When soot deposits on white surfaces, it not only causes them to melt, but also causes them to grow darker and absorb more of the sun's rays. It will change the albedo effect, is what the scientists say, causing further warming. Through the Arctic Council, the United States, while we were in the chair, led an initiative to try to get the countries of the Arctic and the near Arctic to reduce emissions of black carbon, including China. This administration has continued that policy. So it is true that in many other respects, the climate policies of this administration differ radically from those of the previous one, but there are at least some important exceptions, including in the Arctic.
We have time for at least one more. There we are.
Thank you very much for your speech. And my question is, could you tell us about that USA's shipwriter in more details? What can learn, what a lesson for the Chinese cooperation with his labor coast states on that shipwriter? Thank you.
I'm afraid I don't have too much more to add to that. Here are some things I can say. The United States has these types of arrangements with a lot of other countries, typically countries that do not have large coast guards of their own. So we allow their enforcement officials to come aboard our Coast Guard vessels to serve as an additional platform for them to help enforce their own laws, including with respect to drug interdiction, migrant interdiction, fisheries law enforcement, other topics. The cooperation, the shipwriter agreement between the United States and China has to date been limited to one specific topic, limited by producer rights. It's focused primarily on one specific topic, making sure that vessels don't use a particular type of fishing gear known as high seas drift nets, large-scale drift nets. And China was one of the countries that whose vessels used these in the past. China agreed with everybody else at the United Nations in the 90s not to use them anymore, but there still were incidents at sea. And the shipwriter agreement was one way to help enforce Chinese law against these, against the use of these drift nets. Now, it's my understanding that the range of issues that the Chinese shipwriters aboard U.S. vessels might be able to address is likely to increase, cover more types of enforcement issues. That is all to the good, as best as I can see.
Any other questions? I'm just going to use a chair prerogative to say that many people don't understand what the FON is all about, the freedom of navigation. And what it really is doing is reinforcing the provisions that are in the Law of the Sea Agreement. Because in an exclusive economic zone, regardless of whose it is, military aircraft and military vessels have the right to navigate through there. That's one of the most fundamental compromises that was reached at the Law of the Sea Convention. So don't be too distressed if people wring their hands and say, oh, the U.S. is doing fawn exercises in the South China Sea. My reaction is, thank goodness. There's a little ray of hope for these folks because they're out there doing the things that are needed in order to keep coastal state expansion from imposing too much on freedom of navigation. So there can be provocative things that are done that you can argue about, but the fact that a warship has a right to go through an EEZ is not something that is against international law at all. Can get into more refined questions about straight baselines and territorial sea too, but it is all intended, the fawn exercises are intended to be actually reinforcing the state practice in favor of the Law of the Sea Commission. So, last shot, we're for the first time in life ahead of the schedule. Oh,
okay, one more question over there, I saw.
Okay.
I'll make it quick.
I mean, it stirred up a hornet's nest.
The question maybe for you.
It's a question for everybody. I just wondered if you could expand a bit, since we've got a few minutes on the Arctic. China released this paper in January. And what you're thinking of, what is their really long-term plan between, say, now and 2050 on what they want to do there with ice-breaking, Russian deals on gas? There was another element that interested me in it, and that was that whilst it has... China has refused to accept the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in the South China Sea. There were, on my count, 15 references to UNCLOS and international law in the Arctic paper, and whether you read anything into that.
Thank you. Those are good questions. It's hard to address them just in a few minutes, but let me say this at least. There are people in this town who are very worried about what they perceive to be undue Chinese influence in the Arctic. They're worried that China, through its investments, particularly in Greenland and Iceland, will torque the decision-making in both of those places in ways that might not be to the advantage of the United States and the other Arctic states. I am not one of the people who worries about this. I think China's interests in the Arctic, though limited, are legitimate. The way China and Japan and Korea and the EU member states that are outside the Arctic, all have legitimate interests in the Arctic. The Arctic does not belong only to the Arctic countries. Shipping, climate change, science are topics on which all countries have an interest in the Arctic. I read China's paper as a statement that it wants to be recognized for the legitimacy of those types of interests. And I think it was crafted to sell well, particularly in the United States and other places, including through references to cooperation, particularly on science. And yes, the references to the law of the sea that they put in there, I think, were a way to try to build some bridges that may have needed rebuilding a bit after China's refusal to accept the arbitral award. China does know better than the United States how to play a long game, and the Arctic does look to be changing profoundly, and by 2050 there will be a lot more human activity taking place up there. The Northern Sea Route across the top of Russia by 2050 is likely to become used a lot more than now. There's a lot of untapped oil and gas in the Arctic. Currently, it's not economically feasible to develop it, but that could change. Of course, by 2050, we may be, I would hope, have weaned ourselves from fossil fuels largely, and it may not be as relevant as it is today. But there are things to watch, and China is among those who's the best, I think, at watching.
Thank you. I think we're going to quit while we're ahead, but I'm sure Ambassador Bolton would be willing, if anyone has a question you just have welling up inside you, to talk to him after we leave. And anyway, I'd like to just ask for everybody to appreciate this speaker.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Ambassador Bolton. I understand you have a flight to catch. I really appreciate you made the time with us today. Thank you so much. Thank you. So can I invite the next panel to move to the podium? So while they're helping us taking the mic set, you can just take a couple minutes to grab your coffee. We're going to have a long afternoon.